When you're ready.
All right. Yes. We keep on forgetting to hit this record button, and every time when we go into WebEx, we have it already preset to start for us, but Chloe just sent me a reminder to hit the button. Are you in, Harry?
Hello there.
Oh, boom, boom. There we go. Just making sure people are muted so we can keep the interference down. All right. So, welcome everyone. So, on today's webinar, I want to focus on the arm's length relationship. And before we focus on the arm's length relationship, I think it's important to try to understand the differences between, a housing authority and a housing department in terms of the actual functionality. So we're focused on that, as well as some of the key requirements for arm's length relationships. So I'm hoping, we've probably done a little less than within the hour, but if there's questions, we'll carry it through. And again, before I start, I just want to address a few housekeeping issues. So last seminar we raised about British Columbia and provincial statutes in BC allow for the registration of societies, and it's under their Societies Act of British Columbia. And the conversation was that not-for-profit organizations in the province can register as societies. So I took the opportunity to look at the legislation. And in the societies, there's two types. There's a member-funded, and there's what's called ordinary societies. And what I found interesting in the regulations of how they functions, so a member funded cannot receive monies from the public. They can't receive federal or provincial monies. But I'm not sure if that also includes ordinary societies. So my suggestion would be anybody in British Columbia who is looking at the Provincial Societies Act, I guess the question I would raise is ensure that you can receive federal or provincial monies that can be allocated to the housing authorities, including the agreement where you would have the tribal council transfer the funds to the housing authority. Can you do that under a Societies Act? I know you can under a federal not-for-profit, and again, I would encourage people to consider a federal not-for-profit because of the streamlining of practice and the implementation of it. So that's all I'll say on that part. And when you set up these independent or societies or not-for-profits, it's really important to use a lawyer to help set them up properly. So that's for a little bit of housekeeping. So again, I want to go back and just remind us of what is a housing authority. Again, it means different things to different people. And in its truest form, it's an organization that's incorporated under federal provincial legislation as either a corporation or a not-for-profit entity. If we take that definition and then move it over to a First Nation context, again, you want an arm's length housing management body, which may or may not be incorporated. As I mentioned, it's not that you have to go out and set up this huge corporation, pay all these fees and say, okay, now what's next? Usually the general rule is you would move forward, you set up your temporary committees, you form your boards, you form your first directors, and you muddle through on this process. And I say muddle because it is muddling through. It takes time. And then once you realize you're at the point after your first meetings, then you would register that as a corporate entity. So you don't have to do a corporate entity first. Matter of fact, under the Income Tax Act rules is that I believe you have up to 1 year prior for your activities to claim as part of that corporation development. So you have, time to, build up what would be a corporate entity. So what is arm's length? It's defined between a First Nation council of government and a housing authority or a corporate entity that is distinct from chief and council without having separate definitions, right? So the two entities that can communicate, but they act separately. So you have the chief and council, which operates under their either under the treaty or under the Indian Acts or how they function under their authorities. And then you have the housing authority, which is part of the corporation. Important to point out that the housing authority is still accountable back to the chief and council because they're the head of the organization theoretically because of the corporation. But what they do have is the independence in terms of how they function, how they communicate, how they move forward. And that's really important to understand because under arm's length relationships, you want to make sure that the chiefs and councils aren't interfering with day-to-day operations, with decisions, moves forwards. But chief and council are accountable, the housing authority is accountable back to chief and council through their performance, through the delivery of their programs. And again, our last webinar, we talked about objectives and why objectives are so important. So we'll go through a bit more on how this arm's length relationship exists here. I'm just looking at a chat here, and it says, of any examples of community housing authority despite chief and council's resistance? Yes, I would again reference to the Home on the Res podcast that we have on housing authorities. It's our season 1, I believe. And Lou Moody, who's head of their housing authority, talks about this challenges of chief and council originally resisting and then trying to move forward. And again, hopefully we'll answer some of this question as we move on these next few slides. So what is the difference between a housing authority and a housing department? And when we look at these distinctive operations or functions, you can sort of see how they in fact actually operate at arm's length relationships. So let's just look at each one of these items. So in terms of structure, so we have an arm's length relationship via structure. We have corporate bylaws. We have an independent board that includes community members. We're accountable to chief and council and to community. It's a separate organization functioning or focusing on housing issues. So a housing department structure always reports to chief and council. There's no bylaws on how housing department reports to chief and council. And if chief and council, as we know, if they don't like housing departments, as we know, it's hasta la vista for a housing manager, or housing manager quits or moves on. And as we know, this is a huge turnover for a lot of the First Nations maintaining housing managers in respect of decisions that housing managers have to make. Borrowing money. So a housing authority can borrow money for housing, negotiate directly with lending institutions. Once you establish that corporate structure, the financial institutions are going to say, okay, we see that corporate entity, we see the independence from chief and councils, and they can go and negotiate money for mortgages, for loans, for infrastructure. And they have the backing of the chief and council, obviously, but they can negotiate it. So a housing department, they cannot borrow money, and it must be done through chiefs and councils. So the chief and council says, here's your budget housing department, and this is all you get. Granting functions. So the housing authority receives all federal grants and operating money through the house, for the house. And this is done through that agreement. Chief and council receives their money from the federal government. The agreement allocates all that money to the housing authority. And that includes the PYs, the person years, the staffing, and all that goes to the housing authority. We'll look at how that functions in the next few slides. But under a housing department, chief and council provides via a housing budget. So they give you the housing budget and you function with that. So it's somewhat similar in the sense of they get the monies to the budget, but the budget is only controlled by the housing manager, where the housing authority has further controls on how the monies are spent. Revenues goes directly to housing corporation for reinvestment. So all revenues in terms of advertising, selling of for example, laundry or anything that the housing authority functions, all the revenue goes to the housing corporation. Where in the housing department, it goes directly to chief and council, and it may or may not be invested back in housing. So one of the challenges that we have is people say, okay, if I'm going to pay rent, how do I know that money is going to go back for repairs? Well, under a housing authority, there's a greater opportunity of those monies being used to reinvest and repairs through an authority versus a housing department, because the housing department will say, well, sorry, the monies have to be allocated other areas within the council. So a few more key points: audits and evaluations. So under the housing authority, it provides an annual independent audit and evaluation. This is done by a chartered accountant company, and they do an audit of the books. They do, and they provide, a review of how the expenditures take place. Under the housing department, only if chief and council ask for an audit or evaluation on housing. Community involvement. Under housing authority, the communities are the shareholders and they have a direct input. So all the members of the communities are the shareholders of the housing authorities. Whereas in the community, only community members have input via council elections or maybe input in terms of council meetings. But the community does not necessarily have to be heard at a lot of these housing departments. And again, in the consultations we've been doing, the community were 98, 99% for a housing authority, but the chief and council has backed off and saying, well, I'm not sure if we want that. Housing operations. So again, the authority is responsible for the day-to-day operations. That's tenant contracts, rent, collection of rents. Chief and council has no say or input on how rent's collected and how the authority moves to collect the rent. So if they want to move forward to remove people for not paying rent, the authority has the power to do that. It is similar to a housing department, but the collection of rent may or not occur between chief and council. Chief and council decides, well, we're not going to proceed. It's a family member. We understand those circumstances. So there's a number of caveats or challenges that council may use to say, don't act upon rent. We also know in some communities that it becomes an election platform. If you vote for me, we don't have to pay rent. Or in another community, there was a major rent reduction because they were using casino money. But what happened to that housing department, they become in the red very quickly because they did projections on 3 to 5 years. And because there was a rent reduction, they were actually in a hole very quickly because of a political decision to touch rent. So just muting a few people here, getting feedback. There we go. Okay, capacity. Capacity is based on its revenues and expertise. Staff reports to the head of the organization and to the board. There's less turnover in a housing authority because there's decisions are made on a board level and there's no political influence. Where a housing department, many have the expertise, but revenues may not be allocated back, and that there's a high turnover for the housing managers because if the chiefs and councils do not like the decisions, the likelihood of a housing manager being replaced or being in conflict is much higher. So there's no protection under a department. Little more better capacity under a housing authority. Construction under a housing authority responsible for tendering, construction, renovations, ensuring homes are built to national building codes and other standards. Under a housing department, may be responsible for tendering, but may need to work with an engineering department if it exists. Not clear who ensures homes are built to national building code standards in terms of how the homes are being maintained. So under the authority, there's a stronger likelihood that the homes will be built in accordance with national building code standards because they are representing the shareholders, and the shareholders are the communities, and they want to make sure that they're getting good value for their monies. Similar to a housing department, but there's less emphasis in terms of, just build the home. We got to get the home built. And collecting the monies based upon progress versus on codes, buildings. So those were some of the key areas between a housing authority and a housing department. And when we look at those areas, we can see that there's distinct operations and functions of how an authority works versus a housing department. So how do we ensure an arm's length relationship? There's a number of key documents from the housing authority. So for example, there's corporate bylaws. And the corporate bylaws specifically clear of how the board functions, how decisions are made, recording the minutes, how the minutes are going to be held in camera, the meeting, because they're accountable back to the shareholders collectively. Rental agreements, there are clear rental agreements in place, some reflecting provincial, just a sec here, just muting again, sorry. Some reflecting provincial landlord tenancy legislation. Others are close, but at least there's a strong rental agreements. Everybody they have to pay their rent, and there's a process for not paying. There's also a process of how to make sure that the homes are being maintained by the tenants. Waiting list. Under a housing authority, the waiting list is controlled by the authority, and it's picked upon a set of criterias, and it's not necessarily under a housing authority. you're based on criteria, not on political influence of how one will achieve or move up the list of the waiting list. I know for a lot of communities, waiting list is quite controversial, but under a housing authority, at least if everybody knows the rules, knows the processes, knows how something moves forward, at least there's accountability. Because why? The housing authority represents the shareholders, and the shareholders are in fact the community members. So the community members actually have direct input on how these wait lists are put in place. A document for the housing authority is a shareholders agreement. So the shareholders agreement, that's an agreement with the community. So we talked about the objectives in terms of how to build better homes, how to address elders, how to have better communications. So the shareholder agreements are shared with all the members of the community because they are the members of the housing authorities. Where under a housing department, for example, there's no such thing as a shareholders agreement. So you do have housing policies, but the shareholder agreement is more explicitly for a housing authority. And again, making the differences between a influence between chief and council and their roles and responsibilities. One of the other important things for arm-length relationship is operating agreements. There are audits, performance measures, there's evaluations, there's accountability directly back to chief and councils. So if you hire a board and you hire a director, and that director has not moved in terms of changing any housing, the chief and council can actually tell the board, we're not happy with your performance, and so therefore, you need to address those issues. So there's still operating agreements back to the chief and councils because they are still the governing, for the community. So the housing authority, through audits and performance, go back or accountable back to the chiefs and councils. Funding agreements. The requirement for a funding agreement, the bands, like I mentioned earlier, chief and council's monies through a funding agreement goes over to housing authority. That funding agreement talks about dispute resolutions, how the money is going to be spent, accountability processes. So again, chief and council, there's an arm length between the housing authority of even how the money is being spent by the housing authority. They have controls. A band council resolution is another arm's length document. The band council resolution makes it clear on how the housing authority is to be functioned and the roles and responsibilities between chief and council and the housing authority. One of the big documents for ensuring arm's length is code of ethics and conflict of interest documents. We know in many cases under a housing authority, we would have people making decisions. Well, people who work for the housing authority, you have to be pretty explicitly clear if they're making decisions, if they're in, they have to have disclosures, and they have to make sure that they're making decisions that are not going to be benefit to them or any of their family members directly. We saw federally under the We Charity, and we saw how that process works, very similar to a housing authority. Those who sit on the board must excuse themselves or remove themselves from decisions where they're going to be directly in conflict. So again, strong code of ethics, strong conflict of interest guidelines. Under the housing authority, again, you get arm's length. There's clear minutes to the meetings. Every time there's a meeting, they're open to the shareholders, which are the community members. You can hold in-camera meetings, but you have to make it clear that they are actually held in camera, and the board has to set up justifications of why those are in-camera meetings. So, but generally they're open, and they're all reported immediately. I think within 72 hours, you can set that up by your guidelines. or through the bylaws of how it has to be reported back to the community. So we have basically a very open process. The other big issue with the housing authority is dispute resolution mechanisms. We wrote a piece under FNNBOA and I think it's in that manual as well, on the housing authorities, introducing dispute resolution mechanisms. So right now, if there are disputes within housing departments in terms of repairs aren't being made or rents not being collected or issues surrounding decisions, there are very few opportunities for a band member to complain and for that complaint to be resolved, mostly resolved by going back to chief and councils. So under a housing authority, by developing a dispute resolution mechanism, there is a process in place. Everybody understands what that is, of how those issues will be resolved. And in some cases, that may involve hiring a mediator from outside the community to come in to resolve those disputes. So very critical for the operations of a housing authority, and again, assuring arm's length relationships. So by having these set of documents, it's extremely hard for chief and councils to interfere, for better sake of words, within the operation, day-to-day operation of a housing authority. And what happens, it's very clear that the housing authority will be moving forward. So in the case of Manitoba and a few housing authorities, if the chief and council has a problem, the process goes like so. The chief and council has to submit, or the chief has to submit a letter in writing to the director, and the director will say, thank you very much for that information. We will review it at our next board meeting and how we will respond to that. So it's taken the same way as any other shareholder complaint, and that's how these housing authority moves forward. What, answering the question here, despite resistance from chief and councils, the resistance generally focuses on knowing that housing authorities depoliticize housing decision making. From my research and seeing how this functions, that's usually where the resistance has happened, is saying, oh my Lord, we're going to lose this, this political catch. Those communities that actually have moved forward with housing authorities, the politics of housing is no longer an issue. One of the other notes we had yesterday was the word housing authorities, and I know that you don't like the word authorities. Another word to use would be housing corporation. Some can even call it a housing society for the community, or community housing. You can rebrand, identify the name, but the essence is still you have a corporate entity. So we've been calling it housing authority for sake of a word, because that's what's used off reserve. But communities can be very creative and call it what you want to, but you can also, as long as the agreements, the corporate structures are still there. So how do we get the arm lengths? Again, I played this the other day, but you can see we have established the housing authority. So the chief and council, they do establish the housing authority. Chief and council, through the implementation team, they identify their first board members, right? And then you get the housing authority board, and then the board hires the directors, and you have the departments. And again, important, the loop back is the audit, the accountability, and performance. So the housing authority doesn't become its own, a loose cannon organization. There are still controls and accountability back to the chief and councils. Ultimately, the chief and council are responsible for the performance of the housing authority, but it operates again at arm's length. They can't tell them how to function day to day, but in terms of the overall operations, are they achieving their goals? Are they, building new homes? Are we seeing improvements in the housing stock? Are elders getting better housing, care? Those, as we talked about in our last webinar, the objectives will determine by chief and councils how well the housing authority is functioning. So how do we transfer to a housing authority? One of the models that I've seen, and again, is to take the existing housing department, and that housing department is now reporting to the director of the housing authority. Your paychecks don't change, your benefits don't change. What basically happens is now they report to the director, so that rather than housing manager reporting to the counselor, the housing manager will now report to a director of the housing authority. Benefits and payroll is the same. What I found happening, though, is that under a housing authority, they do hire extra staff. So, for example, they hire, a bookkeeper. They hire people who will help set up, policies for rental review, rental implementation. They will hire an engineer, for example, that's responsible for, managing for the new housing projects. So the housing authority will hire people that it needs to implement housing objectives. But in terms of the actual department, Friday you're reporting to chief and council, and on Monday you're reporting to the director of the housing authority. And then the director will, as part of that move, put in performance evaluations for a lot of the HR requirements. Some housing authorities have actually even hired their own HR person on a part-time basis. So once the authority is established, you need to, establish personnel framework, how you're reporting, how it's going to report, what more people are going to hire. So even housing inspectors are sometimes transferred over to the housing authority, or they sometimes stay with the chief and council. The reason I raise that is because of the independence of the housing inspector. Theoretically, they should be independent, but sometimes it's just as easy for them to function under the housing authority. So to better illustrate that, this is where I have the chief and council, you have the housing department, administration and maintenance, and all of a sudden they're shifted over to the housing authority. I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud here, I don't know of other cases where they haven't, I just know there's about 4 or 5 housing authorities. And generally, I'm just going through my list here, and I believe most of them did work with chief and councils, but they just report differently to the housing authority. So again, they report to a director on Monday, where the housing manager is reporting to chief and council. Whoop. So the next is once the housing authority is established, they need to hire executive directors and directors. And again, I hate to use the word, but create the required bureaucracy that's needed to implement a housing authority or to carry out the corporate objectives. In the document that we sent out earlier on housing authorities, we have a number of career, what you call it, sheets when you want to hire somebody, what you're looking for in terms of executive directors. So one of the big highlights is, you want somebody who is financially, has a background in financing or accounting. Is generally the big one for housing authorities. So So that's basically, I don't want to go into another topic. I sort of want to keep in tune with the Housing Authority. I don't know if there's any questions or comments or, and again, I just, just have the one question I've answered. Okay, I can't see. There we go, participants. There we go. Go ahead. And I can't see, I'm working off my laptop, so I cannot see everybody's picture. So if somebody's putting their hands up, I can't see that. So just open the mic and raise the question.
Razika has presented a question.
Yeah, okay. Is it a challenging to discourage interference of chief and council, et cetera, in the operation of a housing authority? Oh, and how can it be resolved? Again, so generally, when I've met with chief and councils to explain how housing authority operates, so you explain how housing authority operates. I've met with chief and councils, and you sort of like see a relief on the chief's face, on the council response for housing, and look at each other and say, oh, I like this idea because I no longer have to deal with members of the communities about rent and about leaky taps, about changing light bulbs, or that rent or income and shelter issues. So all those issues, chief and council sort of like sees it as a major relief. But then on the other hand, they sort of want to continue because of they're trying to help the communities. I think the way how to resolve a lot of issues is that chief and councils need to understand how housing authority functions, and housing authorities have to have clear communications back to chief and councils to say, yes, we're resolving these issues. Member so-and-so had these issues and we resolved it. So it's important that the chief and council knows that many of these issues are being addressed. So how can you have it happen? Clear communications, open dialogue between the housing authority and the chief and councils, almost weekly meetings. These are the issues and this is how they're being addressed. So, I think once the chief and councils figure that, oh, this is being handled, they get that comfort level. So clear communications between the authority and the council. Okay. So how many housing authorities are there that have a corporate structure? I only know of 4 of them in across Canada. There's one that was actually in Ontario that was structured, and they moved forward as a housing authority, and they established a housing authority and moved forward. Housing, my understanding was, being built better. There was more housing allocations. But then the authority ran in conflict with the chief and councils. There was a lot of headbutting, and then chief and council, through their authority, shut down the housing authority. And so I know that did not go well. There's one in Manitoba. The housing authority in the north, which we did the podcast on, Lou Moody's group and the Cree up in Fort Nelson, they are actually in the process of registering as a corporate entity because they want to get financing directly from the banks. So I know that they have done it or in the process of doing that, which is fine. They've been operating for a couple of years. So now they're at the stage where they want to go directly and get direct financing from the bank, and they're going forward with that. There is there's a couple, there's one in Alberta that's registered as a housing authority, and those are the only ones that I know of. And how I did my research is you can go into the corporate searches and databases and find out who's incorporated. So that's how I found. So is housing authorities, corporate structures new? I only know about a half a dozen. I'm confident there's going to be more down the road once people understand how they can function and the independence. But, at this stage, we have a lot of housing authorities that don't have the structures, which are fine, but hopefully eventually they will gain the independence.
Yeah, we have another question there regarding housing committee and elected representatives from the community. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, common committees. Yes, absolutely. So the problem of having elected officials on housing committees is it politicizes any potential decisions. There's conflict of interest. So, I know on presentations, community encounter or meetings I've had, this comes up a lot. One approach is to have the elected officials sit as an observer on the housing committees. But generally, you would want the community to move forward without having elected officials, because I see it as there's a conflict. You're not depoliticalizing, which is one of the main goals of a housing authority. So it seems reasonable that residents feels represented. So I would think elected representatives, if they insist, an observer status is a good portion, but usually you'd want the membership to move forward. Sure, there's enough members and elders that could actually, help set up the housing committees.
So hi, John. Can I just jump in here?
Yes, please.
So my question that I had asked earlier was referring to elected members. What I meant by the not elected officials, so not chief and executive council or the legislative members. I am talking of members from the community that form certain committees. So the committees have a fair representation of youth, elders, and others from the community.
Okay.
And like a formal body. So just like there are other committees in the community, like a natural resource committee or agriculture advisory committee, similarly a housing committee that comprises of a fair representation of the membership. And this committee basically keeps, I guess, is a keeper of all the concerns, issues, gaps, requirements, what kind of housing is lacking or affordability or any other issues within the community. And the housing authority has more of people who have specific skills, right? Like the executive director and the board who has either financial skills or have experience in housing development or whatever, right? So they may be folks that are not necessarily from the community but have certain skills. So they may be from the industry professionals, but they're volunteering their time and they're on the committee. But they are helped by this resident housing committee who basically brings things to them, and they're a representative of the members. So that's what I meant.
Yeah, absolutely perfect. If you have if the energy is in the community to establish that, is absolutely wonderful. Because I know that in one of the communities, they were hoping to elect, community, members and appoint people who have interest. So yes, if they're the non-political in terms of chief and councils, but being elected from the, other community grassroots, that's absolutely wonderful. If you have that number of members, in which Towessalon would have a fair lot of members, they could do that. Perfect.
But my question was, is it like a common model? Have you seen it with other communities?
No, because they don't have the large populations.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. If that's it, next week will be the focus on some of the housing policies and operate under housing authorities and how to move with rent and identify rent under housing authorities or even under housing departments. They're pretty similar in terms of that functionality. So if that is it, thank you.
John.
Go ahead.
Sorry, John. So you earlier talked about all the documents to ensure the arm's length structure of the housing authority, and we are actually right now, Tsawwassen First Nation is in a situation where we are finalizing sort of the business plan model for a housing authority, and then the next phase is going to be actually recruiting and putting this structure together.
Okay.
And of course, finalizing the vision, mission, all that is outlined in the business plan too. But I was wondering if you have examples of things like shareholder agreements, funding agreements, or the dispute resolution documents, or any rental agreements. Like, we can get rental agreements, it's a little bit more common than other things. So I wanted to know if you have any such resources and examples for us.
We do, and I'll send those out to everyone, because we have suggested structure, suggested shareholders agreements. We have all those documents. I'll send it out to everybody. So
are they like sort of templates that can be be tailored to our needs?
Yes, you just it says XXX First Nations, and you just put Tsawwassen in there.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, we made it very simple. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. And our next one is on Monday. So enjoy your weekends. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.